There are places where the ground gives you no warning. It looks simple enough, and yet it isn't. You've probably walked past one yourself. A slope that seems gentle, a trail that appears shorter than it is, a hollow where the wind settles and forgets to move on. Such places never announce themselves. They simply wait. Maybe a season, maybe 100 years. Then someone doesn't return, and the county writes a single word on a page, and that word never quite fits. Wandered off. Lost. Presumed. 6 choices the state gives a sheriff, and none of them describe what truly happens. I have been going through these files for a long while now. I've come to recognize the shape of the wrong word. This one, the one I'm about to share, took a woman who was still in her house shoes, and the sheriff who wrote that word did so with a shaking hand, and he never closed the file. He told the man who took his place not to send anyone up that mountain, because the word we have is not the word for it. A note before we begin. If you find yourself wanting more cases like this, I have not just 1 but 10. Each told in full, in a voice meant for the dark, gathered in a collection called What the Mountain Keeps. 10 files from 10 counties across 5 states, spanning 1893 to 1955. Each person walked up into ground that looked easy, and each was signed off by the law with the wrong word. 10 hours to sit within the dark, from start to finish. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now then, this is one of those cases. It took place in the autumn of 1894 in a hollow of the Blue Ridge that the locals called Coldiron Gap. And before I begin, do me a small favor. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what the weather is like outside your window right now. I like to know. Some of these stories travel better with company. Coldiron Gap sat about 11 miles west of the county seat, up in the kind of high country where the road stopped being a road about a mile before you got there, turning into 2 ruts and a hope. In 1894, maybe 60 families lived up in that pocket of the mountains. A blacksmith, a general store, a small frame chapel with a bell that had been hauled up on a mule the year Grant died. There was a mail drop at the store twice a week, if the weather held. There was a spring house behind the chapel, where the women brought butter in the summer. There was a rope-strung ferry a mile downstream on the creek, but it only ran when the miller's boy could be bothered to work the pulley. The county road agent came through in the spring and again in the fall, and he always said the same thing: Coldiron Gap didn't really need a road, because the people up there didn't seem to want one. Above the town, on the north-facing slope, there was an old logging camp that had been shut down since 1871, when the company that owned it went bankrupt. What remained were 2 long bunkhouses with their roofs caved in, the iron rim of a mill wheel half buried in leaf mold, and a set of skid rails that ran up the slope and then stopped, as if the men working them had laid down their tools one day at noon and never came back. Higher still, above the logging camp, there was a spring, cold and slow, seeping up through moss into a stone bowl cut by someone long ago. And above that spring, there was a place folks simply did not walk to. Not because anyone had ever told them not to, just because. If you'd asked one of them why, they'd have looked at you like you'd asked why they didn't eat with their offhand. The answer was the same: because they didn't, because their people never had. Vera Sawduth was 34 years old that October. Tall for a mountain woman, nearly 5'10", with the long, straight back of someone who had never been easily put down. Her hair was the color of a wet chestnut, worn in a plain knot at the nape of her neck. Her hands were narrow and quick, with small silvery scars on the pads of 3 fingers from paring apples in poor light. She had been married to Absalom Sawduth for 11 years. He was the blacksmith, 41, broad-shouldered, calloused past the wrist. A quiet man. Not slow, just quiet. He had that way certain smiths get, where they've watched fire so long they no longer feel the need for small talk with it, or with anyone. He loved Verna. That part was not a secret. Everyone in Coldiron Gap could see the way his eyes softened. When she walked into the smithy at noon with his dinner tin, he was the kind of man who would have gone into the mountain after her, and he did. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Verna kept the medicine cupboard for the Gap, not a doctor. But a woman other women went to when they had a cough they didn't want to bring down to the county seat, or a burn from the stove, or the sort of grief that won't leave the chest. She kept dried yarrow bloodroot and slippery elm in labeled tins on a shelf above the washbasin, and she kept a small leather book of things her grandmother had taught her, written in a hand so tight and neat you almost had to squint to read it. She wasn't paid for this. People brought her jars of preserves, a shoulder of hog at butchering time, or a bolt of muslin at Christmas. She kept the accounts in her head. She was known in a quiet way up and down the ridge for 6 or 7 miles in every direction. Every fair evening from April until the first snow, Verna had a habit: she would walk. She'd leave the smithy about 4:15, take the road east out of town for a half-mile, then turn onto a footpath that climbed the north slope through the old cut. The path went past the empty logging camp, past the spring, and stopped about 20 yards further at a flat rock she liked to sit on. She'd sit there maybe half an hour, watching the light fall off the far ridge. Then she'd come back down. She'd been doing this since she was 17, when she had first come over from Watauga to keep house for an aunt in the Gap. She kept on after her aunt died. She kept on after she married Absalom. She kept on every fair evening for 17 years. And never once in all that time had she stayed up on the ridge past dark. She was not afraid of the woods. She was not that kind of woman. She just knew, the way people up there knew, that you came down before dark, and she always did. Ottilie Pettibone, who lived in the last cabin before the path started, had set her watch by Verna Saduth's walk for 11 summers. Ottilie was 47 that year, a widow of the flood of 89, thin as a rake handle, with pale eyes and a habit of standing on her porch to smoke a clay pipe her husband had made her. She saw everything that went by. So, when I tell you that on the evening of Wednesday, October 10th, 1894, Verna Saduth walked past Ottilie's cabin at 4:04, gave a small wave, and did not walk back down before dark, you can trust that. Ottilie was certain. She sat out on the porch until the last light was off the ridge. She saw the smoke rise from the Saduth chimney down in town. She saw the smithy shutter close. And she did not see Verna come down, she said later. She went to bed uneasy that night. Not afraid, uneasy. There's a difference, and people who live at the edge of the woods know it. Absalom noticed at supper. Verna always kept a covered plate for him on the stove. She was always home to lay it out. That evening, the plate was still under its cloth, cold, when he came in at 6:30. He said her name once, the way he did. Lo. Then he walked outside and stood in the road, looking up at the north slope, and stood there long enough that his neighbor Farron Skaggs came out to ask what was the matter. Farron was 72 that year, a retired mail rider with a bad hip and a good memory. Absalom said Verna hadn't come down from her walk. Farron looked up at the slope himself. It was full dark by then, and said, "And I want you to hear this exactly." Farron said, "Absalom, don't you send anybody up there tonight. Wait until daylight." Absalom asked him why, and Farron didn't answer. He said good night, went back inside, and did not open his door again until morning. That in itself, if you knew Farron Skaggs, was strange. He'd walk the ridge in blizzards to deliver the mail. He wasn't a man to leave a neighbor out in the dark. But he wouldn't go up there that night, and he wouldn't say why. Absalom took his lantern and walked as far as Ottilie's cabin. Ottilie came out on her porch in her nightclothes with a shawl and said the same thing Farron had said, in different words. "Don't you go up past the mill wheel tonight, Absalom Saduth. You wait till it's light." Absalom didn't go up. He stood on the path with the lantern hissing in his hand until his arm got tired. He called her name once. Just once. He said later he stopped because the sound of it came back to him wrong. He couldn't put the wrong into words, just that it didn't sound like his voice by the time it came back off the trees. He went home. He did not sleep. And I'm going to pause here for a moment, because if you've ever waited up for someone who didn't come home, you know that hour, the one between 300 and 400 in the morning. The one where the house makes noises it doesn't make in the daytime. Have you ever waited that hour out? Tell me in the comments. It's the honest kind of dark. Vera Saduth came down off the ridge at 19 minutes past 6 on the morning of Thursday, October 11th. Ottilie saw her first. Ottilie had been up since 500, unable to sit still. She'd put a kettle on twice and forgotten it both times. When she looked out the kitchen window and saw a shape moving down the path in the gray light, she said her whole body went cold at the top and warm at the bottom all at once. The way it does when you see something your mind hasn't yet agreed to. She went out on the porch. Vera was walking down the path slow, not limping, slow. Her arms hung straight at her sides. Her hair had come loose from its knot. Her boots and the hem of her skirt were caked with a red mud that Ottilie did not recognize, because there is no red clay of that color anywhere in Coldiron Gap that Ottilie knew of. And she'd lived there her whole life. Ottilie called out to her, asked if she was hurt. Vera kept walking. She passed within 6 feet of Ottilie's porch and did not look at her. Her eyes were open. She was breathing. She looked, Ottilie said, like somebody who had been given a set of directions and did not want to lose the count. She walked the last quarter-mile into town without stopping. She went in through her own back door. She sat down at her kitchen table. She put her hands flat on the wood, palms down, and did not move. That was how Absalom found her. He said later he hadn't gone to bed at all, that he'd been at the front window watching the road and hadn't seen her come in. He heard the back door click. He went into the kitchen. She was already sitting at the table. He said her name. She turned her head. She looked at him and said, in her own voice, plain and quiet, "Absalom, is the water hot?" He said it was. She said, "Good, I'd like to wash." She stood up, walked to the wash basin, and undid the fastenings of her sleeves. And Absalom saw her hands. Now, I'm going to tell you what he saw, and I'm going to tell it the way he told the doctor, because Absalom Saduth was not a fanciful man. And I trust the way he said it. Vera's hands were dirty. That was the first thing. Red mud up under the fingernails and worked into the small scars on her fingertips, like she'd been pressing them into something. The second thing was that the small silvery scars from the apple paring were on the wrong fingers. Absalom had held her hands 10,000 times. He knew where those scars sat: left hand, thumb, forefinger, ring finger. That morning, they were on her right hand instead. Same pads, same 3 fingers, same shape, just on the other hand. He said later he stood there a long moment. He thought maybe he was tired. He thought maybe he had it wrong. He didn't say a word about it. He drew her a basin of hot water, sat down at the table, and watched her wash. She washed her hands, her face, and her forearms. She did not hurry. When she was done, she sat down across from him and said she'd like some tea, and he made it for her. She drank it. He asked her gently where she had been. She looked at him over the rim of the cup and said, "Absalom, I don't remember." She said it the way you'd say the weather. He asked if she was hurt. She said no. He asked if anyone had done her harm. She said, and this is what he told the doctor. "No one hurt me, Absalom. There was no one up there but me." She said it too quickly. He noticed that too, but he didn't press her. He was, remember, a quiet man. He thought if he waited, she would tell him. He fetched Dr. Wentworth Kittredge that same morning. Dr. Kittredge was 58 that fall, a Bristol, trained physician who had come out to the county in the 70s and stayed. He kept records. That's important. He kept them in a leather-bound daybook with a small brass clasp. After all of this was over, that book went into a locked cabinet in his office in the county seat and stayed there until the summer of 1922, when his grandson opened it out of curiosity and read what was inside. Kittredge examined Verna Sudduth at 80 Huns Evro on the morning of Thursday, October 11th, in her own kitchen. He noted that her pulse was steady, her pupils equal. Her temperature was a full degree below normal and stayed that way for the 3 hours he was in the house. He noted the red mud on her boots. He asked to keep a scraping of it, and she said yes, without seeming to care one way or the other. He noted that she had no memory of the previous 14 hours and no distress at not having any. He noted in a hand that was neater than it needed to be that the scars on her fingers were on the wrong hand. Absalom had told him about that quietly in the back room before the exam. Kittredge did not bring it up with her. He wrote it down, and at the very bottom of that day's entry, he wrote a sentence that his grandson read 28 years later and could not sleep the night he read it. Kittredge wrote, "And I have this in a photostat from the county library." Mrs. Sudduth returned. Something else also returned. Cannot yet say what. And a breath here before what comes next. If this is the kind of case you'd want to sit with in the dark. Not just hear it once but keep it. There's a collection I put together with the people at Forbidden Resolved Stories. What the Mountain Keeps, 10 complete cases, 8 hours, 62 years of records nobody wanted to finish. Each one placed, dated, and signed off with a tidy word that never once fit what happened. The link is in the description below and at the top of the comments. Let's go back to it. The first 3 days after Verna came down were, by every account, ordinary. She cooked. She swept. She sat at the door of the smithy at noon with Absalom's dinner tin. She was quieter than she had been. She held Absalom's hand at supper, something she had not done in some years. Not because they had grown cold to each other, but because they had grown easy. And easy people don't need to hold hands. That week, she held his hand at every meal. Absalom told the doctor later that he had wanted to believe she was only tired. He had wanted to believe the walk had frightened her more than she would say, and that she was warming back toward herself. He said he sat across the table from her that first Sunday and watched her butter a biscuit and thought, "There she is. That's my wife. We'll be all right." Then on Sunday night, at about 2:15 in the morning, he woke up because she was not in the bed. He got up and walked through the house in his sock feet. The kitchen was empty. The front room was empty. The front door was open. Verna was standing in the middle of the road out front, in her nightgown, barefoot, looking up at the north slope. It was cold enough that morning that there was a rim of frost on the wagon ruts. He said her name. She did not turn. He walked out to her, put his coat around her shoulders. She let him. He walked her back inside. She let him. He put her back in bed. She let him. In the morning, she did not remember any of it. She was sorry for it. She cried a little at the kitchen table and said she was sorry. Absalom held her, and she said, "Absalom, I don't want to go up there again." "Not ever." He said she wouldn't have to. He believed it when he said it. That afternoon, Ottilie Pettibone came down into town, which she rarely did, and asked to see Dr. Kittredge alone. She would not sit down. She stood in his front room with her shawl still on and her hands folded in front of her. She told him that on Sunday night, at about 2:20 in the morning, she had gotten up to use her chamber pot and had looked out her kitchen window and had seen someone standing on the path halfway between her cabin and the mill wheel, standing very still, facing down toward the town. She said the moon wasn't full, but it was bright enough, and she was sure it was Verna Sudduth. She said Verna was not in a nightgown. She was in the same dress she had come down the mountain in, red mud and all. She said the figure did not move for the 12 or 13 minutes. She stood at her window watching. She said the figure's arms hung at its sides in the same still way Verna's had that morning coming down. She said, and this she said quietly, that the figure's head was tilted just a little, like it was listening for something. Kittredge wrote that down, too. He asked Ottilie gently if she was sure. Ottilie said she was sure enough that she had bolted her door for the first time in 14 years and had not slept, and had come down to town at first light to tell him. She said she had lit every lamp in her cabin and sat in the middle of the kitchen with them all burning until the sun came up. Her lamps had put a soft yellow into her windows that anyone on the path would have been able to see. She said she wanted that. She wanted whatever it was to know she was awake. Kittredge asked if she had told anyone else. Ottilie said no. He asked her not to. She said, "All right." She said, "Doctor, is Verna Sudduth in that house right now?" Kittredge said yes. Verna was at home. Absalom had brought her over that morning. She was sitting in his back room now, doing needlework, calm as any Sunday. Ottilie said, "Then who was on my hill on Sunday night?" Kittredge had no answer for her. He wrote in his daybook that afternoon a sentence I will read to you exactly. "The woman on the path and the woman in the kitchen cannot both be Mrs. Sudduth, but they might both be here. And here is where the case gets away from any easy telling. Because on the following Tuesday, October 16th, Verna Sudduth began, in the middle of an ordinary conversation with her husband about salt pork, to speak a name that no one in Cold Iron Gap knew. She said the name as if she were reading it off something. Cletus Renshaw, 31, of Boone. And then she blinked, put down her fork, and said, "Absalom, why did I say that?" Absalom didn't know. Neither did she. She didn't know a Cletus Renshaw. She had never known one. That evening, she said the name again in the middle of drying a plate. Same tone, Cletus Renshaw, 31, of Boone. And then added quietly, "Went up in June of 67 and didn't come down." She looked at Absalom, terrified. She said, "Absalom, I don't know who that is." Absalom went to see Dr. Kittredge first thing in the morning. Kittredge wrote the name down. He went that afternoon into the county seat and asked at the courthouse for the missing person filings from the summer of 1867. There were 3. One of them was Cletus Renshaw, age 31, of Boone, a prospector, filed by his brother on July 18, 1867. Renshaw had gone up into the mountains west of the county seat that June with a mule, a set of picks, and a notion of a silver seam that a Cherokee man had described to him one summer when he was a boy. His brother had received one letter from him from a boarding house in the county seat, dated June 12th. The letter, which the brother had kept and eventually deposited with the courthouse in 71 when he moved west, said that Cletus had found a sign of the seam his Cherokee friend had described, that it was up above a spring in a north, facing hollow 11 or 12 miles west of town, and that he expected to be back down within a fortnight with either good news or a story to tell. After that, nothing. The mule was found near the head of Coldiron Creek in late August. The pics were not. His brother came out from Boone that September, made inquiries at the county seat, and rode up as far as the old logging camp with a hired man from the Gap. They did not go higher. The hired man, whose name in the file was given as Riley, would not go past the mill wheel. The brother went back to Boone. He filed the missing person paper the next spring. Cletus Renshaw was never found. His file, when Kittredge held it in his hands in the county courthouse in October of 1894, had not been opened in 27 years. The clerk apologized for the dust. The clerk was a soft-spoken older man named Percival Hogue, who had been in that office since '68, and who told Kittredge quietly, when Kittredge signed the file back in, that in his experience, files that came out of that drawer went back into it the same day and did not want to be looked at again. Kittredge asked him what he meant by that. Percival Hogue said only that a courthouse learned things about its own paper, and that it was not for him to say more. Kittredge left the courthouse with the file still in his mind and the Renshaw letters phrase. North, facing Hollow, 11 or 12 miles west of town, sitting on top of it like a stone on top of a page. Now, I want you to hold that in your head for a minute, because Verna Seduth was 34 years old. She had been born in 1860. She was 7 years old the summer Cletus Renshaw went up into the mountain. She had not lived in Coldiron Gap then. Her people were from over the ridge in Watauga County. She had not met her husband until 1882. There was no one alive in Coldiron Gap in 1894, so far as Kittredge could ever determine, who had personally known Cletus Renshaw. He had gone up out of a boarding house in the county seat. He had told the landlady he was heading for High Country West, and that was the last anyone heard of him. There was no reason in the natural world for Verna Seduth to know that name. She knew it anyway, and she knew his age, his town, and when he'd gone up. Kittredge came back to the Seduth house on the evening of Wednesday, October 17th. Verna was in the kitchen. She was calm. She had been calm all day. Absalom said it was the calm of someone waiting for a train. Kittredge sat down with her at the table. He asked her gently if the name Cletus Renshaw still came to her. She said yes. She said it was there behind her eyes, the way a word is when you're about to write it. Kittredge asked if any other names had come. She said yes. One more had come that morning while she was drawing water. She said the name was Merriweather. Just Merriweather. She didn't know if it was a first name or a last. Kittredge wrote it down. He asked her, again gently, if she knew where these names were coming from. Verna looked at him a long moment. And then she said something that Kittredge wrote down word for word, and that his grandson quoted at a lecture in 1938 before he was asked to stop. Verna said, "Doctor, I don't know where they are coming from. I know where they are going. They are going down." Kittredge asked her what she meant. She said, "They are going down out of me like water. And there is more of it up there, and it's going to keep coming down. And when it's done coming down, I'm going to go up and get the rest of it." She said that plainly, the way she had said, "Absalom, is the water hot?" Then she blinked. She looked around the kitchen like she had just come into it. She said, "Dr. Kittredge, would you like some tea?" Kittredge stayed the night in the Seduth house. He sat up in the front room with Absalom in 2 chairs pulled close to the stove. Neither man slept. They spoke little. Absalom asked him once if he thought Verna was going to be all right. Kittredge, who was a truthful man, said he didn't know. Absalom nodded and didn't ask again. Around 300 in the morning, they heard Verna get up out of bed. They heard her walk into the kitchen. They heard the back door open. They both went into the kitchen. Verna was standing at the back door in her nightgown, looking out at the north slope. She did not step out. She did not turn around. She said over her shoulder, in a voice that was hers, in the tone she used when she was reminding Absalom to bring in wood. She said, "It's not tonight. Not yet." And she closed the door. She went back to bed, and she slept deep and even until morning. Kittredge sat with Absalom in the kitchen for another 2 hours. He said later, he could not have moved if he had wanted to. He said his legs had gone numb in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Absalom didn't say a word. He sat with his hands folded on the table, looking at the door his wife had just closed. Kittredge wrote in his daybook that night a single line. She is being counted through. I do not know by whom. On Friday, October 19th, Farron Skaggs finally came down to Dr. Kittredge and said he had something he wanted to say and that he didn't want it in the daybook. Kittredge said, "All right." Farron sat down. He was 72. A mail rider all his life until his hip gave out, and he'd ridden the trail up over Coldiron Gap and down into Etowah 4 days a week for 39 years. He knew that mountain the way you know your own hand. Farron said, "Doctor, I have never told anybody this. In the winter of 1867 in December, I was riding the trail up past the old logging camp, and I stopped at the spring to water my horse, and I heard a man calling from up above the spring." Farron said the voice was clear. It was a man's voice. It was calling a woman's name. Farron said the name it was calling was Merriweather. He said he stood there a long minute at the spring, holding his horse's bridle, listening. And he said, and I'm telling this the way he told it, the voice was not coming from up the mountain. It was coming from down inside it, like a man calling up out of a well. He said he didn't go up to look. He rode the rest of his route in a lather. He never took that trail again if he could help it. He would ride the long way around, an extra hour and a half, rather than past the spring. He never told his wife, never told his boss at the post office, and never told a preacher. He was telling Kittredge now because Verna Saduth had said a name that his own wife's mother's maiden name had been. And his wife's mother had been Merriweather Whitlock of Boone, who in the summer of 1867 had had a young man come around to court her, a prospector, whom the family had turned away because he had no prospects, and who had gone up into the mountain that June and hadn't come back. Farron's wife had told him the name once, when they were courting, as a family story. He had forgotten it. Kittredge sat with that a long time. Then he wrote off the daybook on a separate loose sheet that his grandson also found. Whatever is at the spring above the logging camp knows the names of the people who knew Cletus Renshaw, and it is bringing them down through Verna Saduth. God help us. God help her. That was the last note Kittredge made before Sunday. Sunday, October 21st, 1894, was a bright, cold day. Verna went to the little frame chapel with Absalom in the morning. She sat quietly through the sermon. Neighbors said she looked drawn. But so did everybody in the gap that fall, on account of the flu that had come through in September. She spoke to no one about names or dreams or walks. She held her husband's hand on the way out of the chapel. That afternoon, she took a nap. Absalom went out to check on the smithy fire. He was gone about 20 minutes. When he came back, the front door was standing open and Verna was gone. She had left in her Sunday dress. She had taken no coat. She had left her boots by the door and had gone out in her house shoes. The house shoes were still on when she was found. That was one of the details Sheriff Rufus Threlkeld could not get past afterward. Absalom went out on the road and looked up. There was a shape moving up the north slope. He ran. 41 years old. 40 pounds heavy in the shoulders and neck, in his Sunday clothes, up a path he didn't usually take. He caught up with her just above Audley Pettibone's cabin. Audley was on her porch. She saw everything that happened next. Absalom took Verna by the arm. He said her name. She looked at him. She smiled, the way she used to smile at him when they were courting. Audley said, gentle and a little shy, like she was pleased he had come. She said, Absalom, please let go of my arm. He didn't let go. She said, Absalom, please. He shook his head. She said, all right. And she turned and walked up the path, and he walked with her, because he wasn't going to let go of her arm. Audley called out, Absalom, don't you go past the mill wheel. Absalom didn't turn around. He didn't answer her. He didn't let go of Verna's arm. They walked up past the mill wheel. Audley went inside, shut her door, and slid the bolt. She said later she stood with her back against the door and prayed out loud for a long time. She didn't know how long. She said she prayed until her mouth was dry. Then she opened the door and looked. It was going on evening. There was no one on the path. Absalom Saduth came down the north slope at 700 in the morning on Monday, October 22nd. He came down alone. His Sunday shirt was torn at both shoulders. His hands were bloody at the palms, not the knuckles. The palms, as if he had held onto something rough for a long time and wouldn't let go. His face had a scrape from temple to jaw. He walked past Audley's cabin without looking at it. He walked into town. He walked to Dr. Kittredge's, who had been sent for and had come up from the county seat the night before, and who was already at the Saduth house. When Absalom got there, Absalom sat down in his own kitchen. He put his palms flat on the table the same way Verna had done 9 days before. He said, in a voice that Kittredge said sounded like it had been used up, she went into the mountain. Kittredge asked, where? Absalom said, above the spring. Kittredge asked if he had seen her go in. Absalom said, yes. Kittredge asked if he had gone in after her. Absalom said he had tried. He said he had gotten his shoulders through, and something on the other side had taken hold of his shirt at both shoulders and held him there. Not pulling, holding, and had spoken to him and told him to go home. Kittredge asked, carefully, what the voice had said. Absalom would not repeat it. He said only that the voice had known his name, and known his father's name, and known the name of a horse his father had lost in the war, which no one living but Absalom knew. He said the voice told him that Verna was needed, and thanked him for bringing her up. He said he had gone back down the mountain in the dark on his hands and knees, for most of it. He said the mountain hadn't tried to keep him. He said that was the worst part, that it didn't want him. It only wanted her. Sheriff Rufus Threlkeld came up from the county seat that same day. Rufus was 44, a laconic man, unimpressionable, who had done 4 years in the Confederate cavalry as a young man and come home with a jaw that didn't quite close on the left. He organized a search. 22 men. They went up the north slope on Tuesday morning and searched for 3 days. They went past the mill wheel. They went past the spring. Above the spring, on a bench of stone about 40 yards up, they found the entrance to an old adit, a mine shaft that no one in Coldiron Gap living had known was there. It was small. A man could get his shoulders through it, but only just. It went straight back into the mountain. They put a lantern in on a pole. The light didn't carry. They put a longer pole. Same. They called Verna Saduth's name into it. They listened for 2 hours. They heard water deep down, but not moving. They heard once. What Sheriff Threlkeld said in his report was a settling of stone. They did not hear her. 2 of the men wanted to try to widen the entrance. Sheriff Threlkeld said no. He said it plainly, and he said it twice. He said, "We are not opening that." He said he would not have the county's name on the opening of that hole. One of the two men, a young farmer from the far end of the gap named Vardis Culpepper, argued with him. He said Verna Saduth was in there. He said his own wife had gone to Verna Saduth for the cough that had killed her father, and her father had been given 6 good months out of it, and they owed her a widening of the entrance, if that was what it took. Sheriff Threlkeld heard him out. Then he said quietly that if Verna Saduth was in there, she hadn't been in there for 4 days, and that no one who had ever been taken by that mountain had ever come back out, and that widening the hole would put 20 men in the same file. Vardis Culpepper didn't argue with him again. He sat down on a rock at the edge of the bench, cried for a while, then got up and helped the deputies carry the poles back down. He posted a man at the entrance overnight to make sure nobody tried. The man he posted was a young deputy named Elam Coldwater, 26, sober, church-going, a good rifle shot. The kind of young man who would sit up all night in the rain if you asked him to. Sheriff Threlkeld gave him a lantern and a whistle, and told him to blow the whistle 3 times, if anything at all came near the entrance from either side, and to stay awake and to stay well back. Elam said, "Yes, sir." He walked up with a bedroll and a flask of coffee. He was seen at the entrance at 1800 in the evening by 2 men bringing down the last of the search gear. He was seen at midnight by Vardis Culpepper, who had ridden back up on his own to keep him company for an hour, and who reported that Elam had waved him off from about 30 yards down the slope, said he was all right, and asked Vardis to please go home. Vardis went home. Elam Coldwater came down the next morning with his hair gone almost white on one side. He never gave a reason. He resigned that afternoon. He moved to Kentucky the following month. He lived a long life. He would not talk about that night to anyone. His grandson, in an interview taken by a folklore student in 1961, said only that his grandfather had once, drunk on the porch of their house near Hazard, said that whatever was in that mountain had come to the entrance from the inside at about 3:15 in the morning, and had spoken to him through the seam of stone in a voice that had known his mother's baptismal name, a name his mother hadn't used since she was 17. He said his grandfather wouldn't repeat what the voice had told him. He said his grandfather had said only that the voice had told him it wasn't his turn, told him to go home, and told him not to come back. Sheriff Threlkeld went home. He sat up in his own kitchen most of the night, and in the morning he wrote the report. And, in the box at the bottom of the report, where the sheriff had to write the disposition of the case, he had to pick one word out of the 6th estate allowed: missing, lost, wandered off, foul play suspected, deceased, run away. He sat with his pen over the paper for a long time. He wrote wandered off. He signed it. His hand, according to the clerk who took the paper from him, was shaking. He did not close the case. He kept it open on his desk until he retired in 1906. And when he retired, he told the man who came in after him, and I'll tell you the way it was told. Coldiron Gap has a place up on the north slope that took a woman from us in 1894. Do not send anyone up there. If somebody gets lost up there, you write the word wandered off. You write it because it is the word we have. It is not the word for what happens, but it is the word we have. Absalom Saduth did not stay in Coldiron Gap. He sold the smithy in the spring of 1895 and moved down to the county seat, where he took work in a livery. He never remarried. He drank a little more than he had, but not much. He was a regular at the Little Methodist chapel 3 blocks from his boarding house, and he sat in the same pew every Sunday, second from the back on the west side. He was known to weep quietly during certain hymns. When people asked him about his wife, And they did ask, because a blacksmith who'd come down out of the mountains alone was a small piece of news in a town that size. He would say only that she had passed. He wouldn't say when. He wouldn't say how. If pressed, he would fold his hands and go still, and after a while, whoever was pressing would let it drop. He lived to be 71. He died in the summer of 1924 of a chest complaint in the back bedroom of his nephew's house, where he had spent his last 3 years. His nephew, Cyrus Saduth, kept a small notebook of the things his uncle said, in that last year when his mind was going a little. Cyrus was a schoolteacher, and he had a schoolteacher's habit with a pencil. The notebook was donated to the County Historical Society in the 1960s, and it is where a great deal of what I've just told you comes from. In the last month of his life, Absalom told his nephew that he still heard Verna in the small hours, standing on his porch. He said she never came to the door. He said she stood in the road out front, the way she had that Sunday night in October, and looked up. Not at his house, but at something in the sky above his house. He said she did that most nights. He said he didn't go out to her. He said he had gone out to her once in the first year, walked to the edge of the porch, said her name, and she had turned her head to look at him. And he had seen her face, and he had gone back inside and bolted the door, and he had never gone out to her again. His nephew asked him gently what he had seen. Absalom said only that it was Verna's face. It was Verna's face, but something behind it had been counting him, the way a man counts change on a counter. He said he understood at the end that she was not looking to be brought home. He said he understood that whatever was behind her face was only checking every few nights to make sure he was still there. And he said he had a feeling, and this was a feeling he couldn't shake in his last months, that when he died, whatever was checking him would move on to somebody else on the list. Dr. Wentworth Kittredge died in 1902. His daybook, as I told you, went into a locked cabinet and stayed there until his grandson opened it in 1922. His grandson, Isaiah Kittredge, was a young lawyer in the county seat. He read the whole book in one sitting. He didn't sleep that night, nor the night after. On the third day, he took the book to the county library and asked them to make a photostat of the last 30 pages. Then he took the original back to his office and burned it in his fireplace. He said later, when he was much older, that he had burned it because he did not want anyone to try to go up to the spring on the strength of it. He said the photostat was enough for the record. The last page of the photostat, which I have read, has a single line on it, written the morning after Verna Saduth went into the mountain. It says, in Wentworth Kittredge's neat physician's hand, the mountain has taken what it counted out. It will count again. Farron Skaggs died in 1901, in his sleep at 79. His wife, whose mother had been Meriwether Whitlock, outlived him by 12 years. She never spoke of any of this to anyone. Ottilie Pettibone lived to be 88. She stayed in her cabin at the foot of the path her whole life. She would not sit on the porch after dark. When people asked her, she said she liked to be indoors by dark. That was all. She kept her door bolted every night from October 1894 until the night she died, in the spring of 1955, 61 years after Verna Saduth walked up the north slope in her house shoes. Forest Service surveyor named Dwayne Coldwell, who was the great-nephew of that deputy who had stood the watch and come down with his hair gone white, was working a boundary line above the old logging camp at Coldiron Gap. He didn't know the family story. His father had never told him. He had come out west from Kentucky for the Forest Service work in 1953, and he was working a stretch of national forest boundary that hadn't been walked since the 20s. He was alone that Friday. He came up the north slope past the old logging camp and past the spring. He crossed above the spring, higher than anyone from the gap had walked in living memory, following the compass line his supervisor had set for him. About 40 yards above the spring, he came onto a bench of stone and set into the back of that bench. He found what he later described as a very old piece of masonry, no bigger than 3 feet across, sealing what looked like the entrance to a small mine shaft. The stones were fitted tight, the mortar mossed over, and pressed into the mortar of the top course. Where someone standing outside would have pressed it was the flat print of a right hand. Dwayne Coldwell was not a superstitious man. He was a surveyor, 29, 3 years out of the University of Kentucky, with a fresh wife and a first baby coming. He knelt down at the entrance, brushed the moss off the mortar with the flat of his hand. Careful, the way you'd brush dust off a photograph, and looked at the print. It was small, a woman's hand or a small man's, long fingers. The palm print was clean, and 3 of the fingertip prints had small marks in them, silvery marks in the mortar that his brush had almost cleaned away before he saw them. He took his brush off. He looked closer. They were scars. The tips of 3 fingers had scars on them, and the scars had left their raised shape in the wet mortar, dried that way, and sat that way for the better part of 60 years, waiting for someone to look at them. Dwayne Coldwell took a photograph. He had a camera in his pack, a Kodak Retina, and he took 3 exposures at different apertures. One of them came out clear. The photograph exists. It is filed in the County Historical Society under the reference Coldiron Gap Boundary Survey, 1955, Plate 7. If you write to them, they will send you a copy. I am looking at one right now. And the print, if you know what you're looking at, is a right hand. Verna's Adsy scars were on her left hand when she went up the mountain the first time in October of 1894. When she came down, they were on her right. Someone sealed that adit. Someone who had a right hand with 3 silvery scars pressed the palm to the wet mortar and left the print. Whoever they were, they did it from the outside. And you can look at this 10 different ways. You can say the print was a joke done by a mason with scars. You can say the mortar dates are off. You can say the whole story got prettier every time it got told, the way mountain stories will. But you have Kittredge's daybook in photostat. You have Sheriff Threlkeld's open file. You have Absalom Sudduth's own words to his nephew, taken down in 1924. You have Farron Skaggs's story about the voice from below. You have Audley Pettibone's testimony about the 2 Vernas, the one in the kitchen and the one on the path. And you have a small right hand pressed into wet mortar sometime around the turn of the century, in the entrance of an adit that Verna Sudduth walked into in her house shoes. Something up there was counting. It counted Cletus Renshaw in 1867. It counted through Verna Sudduth someone named Merriweather, who Renshaw had loved and never come back to. It counted in October of 1894 Verna Sudduth herself. Kittredge, in that last line, wrote that it would count again. I don't know if it has. I don't know if the Forest Service goes up there anymore. I know Dwayne Coldwell put in for a transfer in 1956 and got it, and did not go back to the Blue Ridge. I know he lived out his career doing timber surveys in the Ozarks, and I know that when he retired in 1988, he moved to a house on the coast of Oregon, as far from the eastern mountains as he could reasonably get, and that he refused to be interviewed about the 1955 survey by 2 separate folklorists and a graduate student at Chapel Hill. I know he died in 2001. His notes, if he kept any, went with him. I know that Coldiron Gap is not on the map anymore. Not by that name. The town went. It began to empty out in the 20s when the young people went down to the mills. The last family closed the door on the last cabin in 1946. The road went, or rather, it stopped being kept, and the county quit sending the agent through in about 1950. The chapel bell was taken down in 1931 and sold for scrap. The store burned in the fall of '38, and nobody rebuilt it. What you can still find, if you know where to look on a topographic map, is a nameless creek and a nameless bench. And above the bench, there is a place where the contour lines pinch together tight enough that you can tell there is stone rising there. The spring is still there. The adit is still there, unless someone has broken the seal since Dwayne Coldwell photographed it in the spring of 1955. And the mountain is still there. It is not a hard mountain. It looks easy. That's the part I wouldn't want you to forget. It looks like ground you could walk on for the pleasure of it. It looks like a good place to sit on a flat rock at the end of a day and watch the light come off the far ridge. And you, if you've made it this far with me, tell me in the comments, is there a piece of ground near you like that? One that looks easy. One that folks in your family will not walk after dark and cannot always say why. Leave it below. I read them. If you know a story like that from your own hollow, your own county, your own grandparents, share it with me. It may become the next case. And stick with me for the next one. I'll be here. Until then, watch your footing.